It's very strange in general how the meaning, even in America, of socialism and communism has changed. Now, in the past, the meaning of socialism and communism meant empowerment. It meant giving people dignity and something to be proud of. Today, the meaning of socialism appears to have been defined entirely by the right wing. But what we have with BreadTube and the synthetic left is that they're just going ahead and perversely adopting this caricature and straw man created by the right wing and embracing that. Oh, communism is for weaklings who hate humanity and are misanthropic and are pessimistic, and they, as you said, they want to kill, stifle people's creative energies, their livelihoods. They want you to be depressed and fear mongering like Greta Thunberg about the end of the world and all this kind of stuff. And they just went, yeah, okay. So now I've kind of seen what the meaning of socialism and so-called communism in the American context has come to mean. It doesn't actually mean any authentic discovery of these ideas within the American context, or I should say rediscovery, because they do have precedent in American history. It rather consists in a way of perversely mocking and teasing conservative people. That's the conclusion I drew.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, I think about communism. I think about William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and Huey Newton and, the leaders of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton and others. Their message was that working people are oppressed by a system that puts profits over people, and that black and white should unite and fight, seize control of the economy, and build a society where working people and their needs come first, and human creativity and progress is no longer restrained. That's their message. But I listen to, the folks on BreadTube, and I'll criticize Bernie Sanders a little bit too. When people say, well, the understanding of socialism is, well, the government gives people free healthcare, the government gives people free education. I mean, I'm for that. I'm not against that. But in a way, they've taken this like very triumphant and heroic message, and they've replaced it with, fuck this shit, give me some free stuff. I mean, that's kind of what I get from a lot of, the message that I get from a lot of young socialists. Like, the world sucks, give me some free stuff. Well, I mean, they deserve some free stuff. Corporations get free stuff all the time. They're not wrong. But like that is such a pessimistic way of looking at things. It's not inspiring. It's not, heroic. And I do think that social media in a lot of ways has really weakened people, right? Mm-hmm. It's really kind of turned a lot of people into very emotionally weak people. I talk about over socialization, right? And that, it's very interesting. B.F. Skinner, who is one of the important psychologists out of Harvard, he did a study and he determined that if you want to control someone's behavior, it's far more effective to reward them than to punish them. Right? Because if you punish somebody, they can just say, well, you're being unfair to me, right? You're victimizing me. And in fact, there's there's a lot of like murderers and rapists and all of that really in their minds think they did nothing wrong and the world's just being unfair to them. People can make huge leaps and backflips to make themselves feel like a victim no matter what. But if you reward somebody, nobody ever goes, I don't deserve this reward. You're trying to manipulate me. You know what I'm saying? So reward is a far more effective way to manipulate somebody. But what you can do with rewards rather than punishments is you can turn people into addicts, right? Mm-hmm. The reward controls people when it gets taken away, right? It's like, oh, well, you don't get a reward this time. You don't get a sticker, little Johnny. You don't get a cookie. And social media has got people programmed, right? We're constantly looking at our phones, oh, did we get another like? Did we get another share? Oh, do the people agree with me or not? Oh, they don't agree with me. And it's gotten people into this state where they're like addicts, the heroin addict has to get their hit. They have to get their hit. We have to get our emotional, reward, our validation from our peers. And if we don't get that, then we got to do something different because we got to get this emotional validation. And it has kind of turned people into addicts where they constantly are craving the approval of others. And they don't have the courage to stand against the mob, right? As much as I'm a populist and all of that, you have to admit the most heroic people in history, you talk about Joan of Arc, you talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These are people that stood against the mob. These are people that took unpopular stands that stood firm in their beliefs and earned the scorn of others, made other people angry. right? And that social media has kind of weakened people and taken away people's ability to be tough and to stand firm and to just say, you know what, these are my principles. This is the hill I want to die on. Come get me, right? And that is what we need to find a way to reinvigorate in people, that heroism. Because I would argue that social media is largely, it's about making people dependent on the approval of others. And the dirty secret behind all of it is we know what they do with their algorithms. It's not really the approval of others, right? They're manipulating it behind the scenes. Silicon Valley, look, there's a whole history of this. It sounds tinfoil hatty. Who set up Silicon Valley as the center of the computer revolution? Okay, the NSA, the CIA. It was a strategic decision. They knew the Soviets couldn't invest in. They didn't have the resources to invest in computers. And the reason that it wasn't the free market that was going to create Silicon Valley. It was very much a result of strategic decision making by the intelligence agencies. They put the USA at the center of the computer revolution. Al Gore, he said, we invented the internet. Well, what he meant was that through strategic decisions, the American government had created, what eventually became the internet, and that, that they are very much using social media and using, the control of the mechanisms of information to try and carry out their agenda. And their agenda is not eradicating poverty in the world. Their agenda is not, lifting people up. Their agenda is staying on top of the world. And you talk about satanic elites. Read The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson, right? Marilyn Ferguson was Al Gore's spiritual advisor. And she wrote this very, very disturbing occultist New Age manifesto called The Aquarian Conspiracy, all about basically how we're out of balance with Mother Nature. And we need to create some kind of, social explosion to, drive humanity down to balance with Mother Nature once again. This is disturbing stuff. A lot of these new left gurus, they seem progressive, but again, the Dalai Lama was not progressive, right? The Indian caste system, was not progressive, and a lot of the Eastern influence, on what's going on in the West. And that's a big thing with like the New Age folks. They're all about the East, right? The Eastern ways. The Nazis were like that too, right? They had this fixation on the East. Whereas in China, the communists have been trying to modernize. They've been trying to get rid of that stuff. This Falun Gong cult that's trying to overthrow the Chinese government, that puts out Epic Times, that's like quoted as a credible source on China. These folks are not Eastern in the sense they're in the developing world fighting, to develop and fighting for progress. They're Eastern in the sense they glorify pre-capitalist feudalism. They glorify the past. They're opposed to human progress, right? And that John Foster Dulles, who was a founder of the CIA, wrote that one of the strategies of the CIA was to promote mystical religious groups that would be against communism in China. And that's long been their strategy. And you can talk about Falun Gong, you can talk about Eastern Lightning, you can talk about the Hare Krishna movement, you can talk about Reverend Sun Myung Moon in South Korea. The use of like mystical reactionary groups to fight against scientific progress in the East. It's been a big aspect of CIA strategy, but also it had a lot of influence on Silicon Valley and the kind of social engineering faction that is trying to dominate the United States and rule with social media. They have a very, very Eastern mystical primitivist perspective, I think, and that influences what they're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up. I want to save it to the end. It's the kind of more interesting stuff. But this thing about the relationship between this type of mysticism and fascism and reaction, and the Nazi thing is self-evident history. Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy was all connected to fascism, and but I think that the way humanity can establish an authentic relationship to its real past and its old religious and even to an extent mystical traditions is by embracing the wealth of modern technology and in a sense modern science, because these people you're talking about, like Falun Gong and these kind of they are making a fatal assumption. They are making the assumption that the pre-modern civilization and society was explicitly establishing itself against modern progress. But that's knocking on an open door. It's just that they hadn't yet encountered encountered what we call modern science and technology and so on and so on. That's why communists were the only ones who actually successfully, I would argue, revived the unique characteristics of their respective civilizations in Russia and also in China. Whereas people like Falun Gong and all these kinds of, you know, I would call them fake mystics and these kinds of religious people glorifying their idealized version of feudalism, they are actually an extension of liberalism, Western liberalism, in my view. I think that's kind of a lesson from, not to get too philosophical or anything, but that's a lesson of dialectics, is that contraries, apparent contraries, can coincide.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, for example, right? Saudi Arabia is one of the most primitive, barbaric governments out there. But that's who the British imperialists set up, and that's who the West embraces. Who do we attack in the Middle East? We attack, governments like Syria that are modern and secular, governments like the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they have women who are brigadier generals in the military and multiple party elections, et cetera. And that this is part of the problem with the synthetic left, is that they've obliterated the economic definition of imperialism. Right? Imperialism is about holding back development so the Western capitalists can keep the world as a captive market. And instead, it's become, quote unquote, cultural imperialism. Right? And cultural imperialism means if you do anything to, if these countries do anything to modernize, right? If in the Arab world, the Baathists come in and build power plants and wipe out illiteracy, well, that's getting away from the beautiful primitive ways. Look at Saudi Arabia. That's a beautiful, I mean, that's the way these people think. I mean, in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, the socialist government, they are working very hard to eradicate poverty. They've wiped out illiteracy. They've done all of this. And the CIA goes and they find like the most like crazy reactionary sects of the indigenous people who don't believe in technology and stuff, and say, oh, look at these indigenous people. They're so angry about what the Sandinistas are doing. I mean, it's ridiculous. It'd be like if you went to, I'm from Ohio, right? Mm-hmm. You could find like an Amish guy in Ohio, and the next time they're building a power plant, put him on TV. Oh, we Ohioans don't believe in electricity. This is not our way. You're oppressing our beautiful Ohio culture. We're Amish here. And this is. I mean, it's and the majority of people in Nicaragua are indigenous, right? And that, again, it's about obscuring the actual definition of imperialism. If it becomes cultural imperialism, then, and I mean, there are, and that's kind of the beauty of modern China is, the first act of Dr. Sun Yat-sen when he launched the revolution was he smashed the idols in the temple, right? And he told the people of China, these are primitive beliefs. We need to be modern and scientific like the West. Mao took that to a whole nother level with the Cultural Revolution. But now in China, they have found like kind of a balance where, that Marxism, Leninism and Mao Zedong thought and Confucianism and some of the aspects of Chinese civilization are able to kind of like have a synergy, right? They reject all the aspects of traditional Chinese culture rooted in feudalism, but they also celebrate a lot of the traditions of Chinese civilization while also embracing scientific Marxism, and that they can walk together, and that's the beauty of it. And that's really kind of what's amazing about Chinese socialism is that they have been able to combine these things, right? And that in the West, we like to glorify primitivism. It's this weird bourgeois thing. I swear, it's like National Geographic magazine. All these rich people, they go to Africa. It's like the zoo or something. They take pictures and they're like, oh, look at these primitive people with their ways. It's so, that's kind of what it is. I mean, a lot of what calls itself, intercultural and a lot of the academic, looking at developing countries is this kind of very sick, tourism, I guess you could call it, right? That's what the West is doing. Meanwhile, people in the developing world fighting for their rights, fighting to raise their countries out of poverty, are able to embrace some aspects of their culture, but also embrace science and progress. And that's a beautiful thing. And I mean, I've been to the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've seen, what they've achieved as a result of the Islamic Revolution. And, there are great things that are achieved when countries break out of Western capitalism. And that's never told, right? That story is never told. And that's one of the problems in the way discourse in the West is. We never know about how great it is when countries break free and start developing themselves and allow their cultures to flourish, but also allow to modernize.